Working with text boxes inside Studio's title editor can be challenging, especially if there aren't any graphics or other landmarks to provide points of reference. In this video, I'll show how to use the alignment tools inside Studio and how I made a grid. So I have some text boxes in here. Normally I would align them first and then format the color and everything. The order doesn't matter. In the title editor, there isn't a grid or a ruler view. There are some internal tools in Studio that can help with alignment. Normally, I would be working from kind of a global position where I'd be putting in backgrounds and graphics and then integrating text and everything all at the same time. So I might have some graphics here and things like that. This might just be a list. Otherwise, what I can do is I can come in here and do some initial alignment, which is going to be horizontal and vertical. And of course, the big issue is going to be vertical spacing. And I can come down here to this group and I can say space even down. And that sort of spaces them out. I'm not sure what the criteria is for that, whether it takes the entire space that's available or the point size on the fonts, but it can space them. I've done a lot of manual spacing, and I'll show that here in a second. The other thing is I can come in here and select everything, and I can do spacing where I line everything up together. And this is what I normally do. I'll line everything up. Even if I'm going to separate them later, I might line them up like this first as a starting point. Now, if I was going to be doing something where I wanted to put more points in, I don't want it to get too crowded. I don't want to shrink the font, but maybe I want to change to a custom alignment. There's two ways I can do that. The first is without a grid. And what I do is I can select the box, and there's the rotation handle here. I use that as an indicator for where the box is at. So I can take this box and I can either put that indicator at the bottom of the text for a spacing, which is kind of where they've put it. I can move that to the top of the next line. Or if I've got really tight text and visually it's not going to look bad to put them this close together, I can take the frame of the text box and slide that up till it just touches the line above. When I do that, I get a fairly good spacing. It's fairly consistent. It is time consuming to do this, and Studio will crash, blink, and blow up. Now, this is a spacing that I like. It is fairly close. Later on the screen for viewing, it's not uncomfortable. It doesn't look jammed up. And then the only thing I have to do is come in here and align left. And then while it's selected, I can position it anywhere. An additional point to that is if I then want to put some graphics in and then rearrange this and space them or move them, then all I have to do is just select and drag wherever I want them. So that is how I generally do it. I usually do the manual spacing. The tools here that Studio has are good. They work. They're okay, but they may not be exactly what I want. So I mentioned a grid, and I thought for a long time it'd be great to have a grid. And I kept waiting for the developers to put one in here, and one never showed up. And then, like I said, the instability in the title editor is enough that I don't want them to put one in here. So I went out to Excel and I created a grid, and I'm going to add a section on that here and show how I created that. Very simply, I opened up Excel, created a blank workbook. I changed the orientation to a landscape orientation. Then I selected all of the cells on the page and applied all borders. Initially, I accepted the default value for the line weight, and it was, of course, black is usually the default for that. So I just went ahead and created that. The next stage was to go ahead and create a PDF. Once the PDF document was created, I simply took a screen capture of it. So I opened up the screen capture in Photoshop, and I'm going to crop it to get rid of anything except for just the grid. And it's going to have a white background, and that's fine. But I go ahead and crop that and then export that as a PNG file. Once I've exported that as a PNG file, I'm going to create a new document, and the document size that I create is 1920 by 1080. And that 1920 by 1080, I'm going to add a layer above the background, and then I'm going to bring in that cropped screen capture that I had. While I've got it there, I'm going to turn the background off or leave it on, it doesn't matter, but I'm going to use the magic eraser tool, and I erased the contents of the cells between the lines. So since it's a high contrast, that's easy to do. Once all the cells are cleared, then I can kill the background, turn it off. I export that as a PNG, and now I have a black grid with no background. So the next stage is I want a light background. So I repeat the same process. I have the file, I have the background there, I create a layer. I'm going to bring in the black grid. I'm going to turn the background off, and then I'm going to invert the grid so that it turns from black to white. And once I have that white grid, I export that to a PNG. So now I have a black grid with no background. I have a white grid with no background. And any additional variations that I want, I can make. So sometimes I might be working with something where I'm not sure about the background, or I want to really work on the text and not really worry about the background or images. So I want maybe a color behind that. So I've created a number of grids with different backgrounds behind them. And I can drop those grids into a project and then use those for alignment. And here's how I do that. Over here in my project, between Graphics 1 and Graphics 2, I'm going to create a track. And I'm going to call this grid. On the timeline, I'm going to go to an initial point here using the navigation keys. And I'm going to create a title. And this is going to touch a little bit on graphics and things. This is getting into the graphics and backgrounds a little bit, but that's going to be okay for right now because I'm going to cover it later. So I'm going to treat this as one of my graphics titles. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this layer, size that down to small. And now I'm going to stretch this out. I will stretch that the entire length of the timeline so that it is available whenever I need it, wherever I need it. I'm going to go out and grab the grids that I've created. All right, that didn't totally crash, so that was good. Sometimes it recovers. Okay, under images, I have my grids. And you can see a number of grids here with different configurations. So I want my white grid here. So I'm going to bring in grid white. And now I'm going to go over to my grid title here that I've created. And I'm going to edit the title. And I'm going to go to background settings. And I'm going to pull the grid over into the background settings. What I can do here is use my playhead to, there's my text. Now I'm going to use the slider here for the opacity and lower this so that I have a grid, but I don't have something overpowering. that I can't see. Now, these are more rectangular cells. I can do another grid and create perfect squares like graph paper or whatever. All I want right now is something that I can use to align. So this is in place, and it gives me a grid that I can use to drag and position things. And even with graphics, I could use that. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when I'm using this, I can, if I want to do custom alignment, I can go in here and I can now use my grid to do whatever. If I don't want the grid to be visible at some point, all I have to do is click the eyeball here and it turns it off. And now the grid is not visible. So if I'm editing later in the file and I want the grid, all I have to do is turn the grid visibility back on. I don't have to remove this. So I don't always use this. As a matter of fact, this is a relatively new thing that I've started doing. I haven't gotten into a habit of adding this grid track, but it is definitely something to consider if you want a grid. A grid will help. And then if you want to do any kind of custom alignment, that alignment can be accomplished with some degree of precision. Transitioning from PowerPoint to video means handling things such as bullet points differently. I'll demonstrate how I use the tools inside Studio to apply motions to lines of text and time them to the audio track.